I should have been suspicious the moment I saw Clara, my wife, laughing too hard at Paul's jokes at last month's family barbecue. But I brushed it off, chalking it up to her being polite to my sister Julia's husband. Paul had always been charming, the kind of guy who effortlessly became the center of attention at any gathering. He was 42, tall, with an easy smile, and the kind of charisma that made everyone gravitate toward him. I never thought Clara would be one of them. We live in Providence, Rhode Island, a picturesque place that often feels more like a postcard than real life. Our kids, Emma, 16, and Max, 13, are in that awkward pre-college phase, where every day is a balancing act between grounding them and giving them space. My life was about routine, work at the real estate agency, evenings spent helping with homework, weekends fixing up our creaky colonial home. Nothing glamorous, but it was our life. The discovery came in the most mundane way. Last Thursday, Emma asked me to fix the Wi-Fi router in the study. She needed it for some group project. As I poked around the cables, I noticed Clara's laptop was still on, her email open. I'm not the nosy type, but the subject line of one email caught my eye. Tuesday night plans, delete after reading. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked it. The sender? Paul, my sister Julia's husband. The email was brief but damning. Can't stop thinking about last week. Meet me at the same hotel, room 312. Usual time. P. My blood ran cold. Room 312. Last week. The words blurred together. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. A rush of denial flooded me. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was some elaborate joke between them. But deep down, I knew better. Clara walked into the room just then, her smile faltering when she saw me at her laptop. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. Emma needed the Wi-Fi fixed, I said, my voice steady, though my hands felt clammy. I closed the laptop, not ready to confront her yet. "You left your email open." Her face didn't change, but I noticed the subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth. A flicker of guilt? Fear? I couldn't be sure. "I'll take care of it," she said quickly, reaching for the laptop. I let her have it, but the gears in my head were already turning. How long had this been going on? And why with Paul? Of all people, my sister's husband? I needed proof. Confronting her without it would only give her room to deny it, to spin some story. But as much as I wanted answers, the idea of what I might uncover terrified me. The moment Clara left the room, I sat in silence, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. The email was seared into my mind. Room 312. Hotel. Usual time. How could she do this? And with Paul, no less. A man I'd trusted, a man I'd invited into my home countless times. I spent the rest of the night replaying every interaction, every subtle glance, every hushed conversation I might have ignored before. Clara had been unusually chipper after the last barbecue at Julia and Paul's house, claiming it was just a great evening. I hadn't thought twice about it then, but now I couldn't stop imagining them sneaking off while the rest of us laughed over beers and burgers. I needed a plan. Friday morning, after Clara left to drop the kids at school, I called the hotel. My fingers trembled as I navigated through their automated system, eventually reaching the front desk. "Hello, this is the Biltmore Hotel. How may I assist you?" A cheery voice answered. I hesitated. "Hi, yes, I was trying to confirm a reservation for room 312 on Tuesday night." "Certainly, sir. May I have the name on the reservation?" I panicked for a second. Paul." I decided to go for broke. "Paul Lyman." "Let me check," she said, her keyboard clacking in the background. A moment later, she returned. "Yes, Mr. Lyman has a recurring reservation for room 312 every other Tuesday." Recurring? My chest tightened, while rising in my throat. This wasn't a one-time thing. I mumbled a quick thanks and hung up before she could ask any more questions. My suspicions were confirmed. I had to be careful. Clara wasn't stupid, and if I tipped her off, she'd either cover her tracks or gaslight me into thinking I was imagining things. I needed solid proof, something undeniable. By Saturday, I had rented a small camera and voice recorder from a surveillance store on the outskirts of town. It felt surreal, like I was starring in some awful detective drama. But this was my life now, and I had to face it. Tuesday afternoon, I took a long lunch break and parked my car across the street from the Biltmore. Room 312's window was easy to spot on the third floor, its curtains closed. I didn't know how I'd feel if I actually saw them walking together, but I couldn't turn back. At 6:47 p.m., Clara's silver Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot. I sank lower in my seat, my pulse racing. She stepped out, wearing the red dress I hadn't seen in years, the one I used to call her date night dress. My jaw clenched. 10 minutes later, Paul arrived in his black Range Rover, casually dressed in a fitted blazer and jeans. I watched as he joined her at the lobby entrance, their conversation muted, but their body language too familiar. He placed a hand on her back as they walked in, a gesture that felt like a slap to my face. Inside, I set up the camera. The floor plan of the Biltmore had been easy to find online. Room 312 was at the end of a hallway, tucked away from the elevators. It made sense, a discreet spot for two people who shouldn't be seen together. I placed the camera inside a small planter by the door, angled perfectly to catch anyone entering or leaving. The voice recorder was hidden under the corner of the hallway runner, close enough to pick up muffled voices if the door was opened. My hands shook as I finished the setup and left the hotel, my heart hammering in my chest. By the time I got home, Clara was already there, lounging on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. "Hey," she said brightly, her smile as effortless as ever. "How was your day?" "Busy," I replied, forcing a neutral tone. "Yours?" "Oh, the usual," she said with a shrug. "Picked up some groceries, went for a jog." I felt a surge of anger, but swallowed it down. The lies were flowing so easily, it was almost impressive. She didn't even flinch. The next morning, I returned to the Biltmore before work and retrieved the devices. The camera footage was clear. Clara entering the room, followed by Paul minutes later. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. The audio picked up snippets of conversation as well, their voices low but unmistakable. "You think he knows?" Clara had whispered. "Not a chance," Paul had replied. "Rob's not exactly the suspicious type." Hearing my name come out of his mouth like that, so casually dismissive, sent me into a blind rage. But I needed to keep my cool. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about protecting my kids and confronting Clara with irrefutable evidence. She wouldn't weasel her way out of this. I stared at the footage, my fists clenched. The time for confrontation was coming. And when it did, I was going to make sure neither Clara nor Paul saw it coming. The next few days were a blur. Every time Clara spoke to me, I heard the faint echo of her voice from the recording, asking Paul if I suspected anything. Every glance she gave me felt like a taunt, as if she knew she'd gotten away with it. But she hadn't. Not this time. I spent my evenings locked in the garage under the pretense of fixing up an old shelf. But in reality, I was planning my confrontation. This wasn't going to be a blind shouting match where Clara played the victim. No, I was going to take control of the situation and expose her and Paul for who they really were. I wasn't just going to confront Clara. I was going to involve Julia. She deserved to know the truth about her husband. Friday evening came faster than I expected. Clara had been in a cheerful mood all day, talking about an upcoming PTA meeting and casually suggesting we spend the weekend watching movies with the kids. The audacity of her normalcy enraged me, but I played along. "I think that's a great idea," I said, smiling. "Let's make it a family weekend." That night, once Clara was asleep, I texted Julia. "Can we talk? It's urgent." Her response came quickly. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" "Not really. It's about Paul. I think you need to know something." She called me immediately. "Rob, what's wrong?" Her voice was edged with panic. Julia, 2 years younger than Clara, was the sort of person who always saw the best in people. I hated that I was about to shatter her world, but she deserved the truth. "I'd rather explain in person," I said. "Can you come over tomorrow morning? I don't want to discuss this over the phone." After a pause, she agreed. "I'll be there at 10. The next morning, Clara left early to take Emma to soccer practice, leaving the house empty except for me. At exactly 10 a.m., Julia's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, her face tight with worry. "What's going on?" she asked as I opened the door. "Come in," I said, leading her to the dining room. "This isn't going to be easy to hear." Her eyes narrowed. "Is Paul okay?" I let out a bitter laugh. "That depends on how you define okay." I slid my laptop across the table, the video footage queued up. "Before I show you this, I need you to understand that I didn't go looking for this. I stumbled on something, and I had to know the truth." She frowned, clearly confused. "What are you talking about?" "Just watch," I said, pressing play. The video showed Clara entering room 312. then Paul arriving minutes later. Julia's face twisted with confusion, then dawning horror as the truth hit her. By the time the audio started, her hands were trembling. "You think he knows?" Clara's voice whispered. "Not a chance," Paul's voice replied. Julia's jaw dropped. She turned to me, her face pale. "No," she said softly, shaking her head. This can't be real." "I wish it weren't," I said grimly. "But it is." Her breathing quickened as the video played on. When it ended, she pushed the laptop away and buried her face in her hands. "How long?" she whispered. "How long has this been going on?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But from what I gathered, this isn't the first time." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do?" I told Julia my plan, to confront Clara and Paul together. It wasn't enough for them to face their individual spouses. They needed to see the destruction they caused to both families. Julia agreed, her shock hardening into determination. That afternoon, while Clara was out, I called Paul. "Hey, Rob," he answered, his tone friendly and familiar. Hearing his voice sent a wave of anger through me. "Paul," I said curtly, "I need you to come by the house. There's something we need to discuss. It's important." "Sure," he said, a hint of hesitation creeping into his voice. "Everything okay?" "It will be," I replied. "See you at 6. By the time Clara returned, Julia was already at the house. We kept our conversation light, waiting for Paul to arrive. At exactly 6 p.m., his Range Rover pulled into the driveway. Clara glanced out the window, her smile faltering. "Is Paul coming for dinner?" she asked, her voice tight. "No," I said, standing. "He's here because I invited him." Her eyes darted between me and Julia. "What's going on?" "You'll see," I said, heading to the door to let Paul in. When he stepped inside, his usual air of confidence wavered as he saw Julia and me waiting for him. "Hey, what's this about?" he asked, forcing a smile. I closed the door behind him. "Take a seat, Paul." He hesitated, then obeyed, glancing nervously at Clara. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her face pale and her hands fidgeting. I placed the laptop on the table and pressed play. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the laptop as the video played. Clara's face drained of color, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her chair. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his confident facade cracking with every second that passed. Julia sat rigid, her arms crossed, glaring daggers at her husband. When the audio began, Clara and Paul's whispered conversation about whether I suspected anything. I could see the moment Clara's composure broke. Her lips trembled, and she shot a desperate glance at me. Paul, on the other hand, sat motionless, his jaw tightening as he realized there was no escape. When the video ended, I closed the laptop and folded my arms. "So," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Care to explain?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at Paul, as if willing him to take the lead. Paul finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Rob, I don't know what to say. How about the truth?" I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. "How long has this been going on?" Clara flinched at my outburst, but Paul remained silent. Julia leaned forward, her voice cold. "Answer him, Paul." Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's been a few months," he admitted. "It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" Julia's voice rose, sharp and furious. "You've been sneaking around with his wife, my sister, for months, and you have the nerve to say it didn't mean anything?" Clara finally found her voice. "Rob, please. I can explain." "Explain?" I said, laughing bitterly. "Go ahead. Explain how you thought it was okay to betray me, to betray our family with him." I jabbed a finger in Paul's direction, the man I trusted like a brother. Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. I've been feeling so lonely, and you've been so distant. Don't you dare." I interrupted, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I've been here. I've been working to support this family, to give you and the kids everything you need, and this is how you repay me." Julia turned to Clara, her tone icy. "And what about me, Clara? What about our family? You didn't just betray Rob. You betrayed me too. How could you do this? To your own sister?" Clara looked down, her tears spilling over. I don't know," she whispered. Paul tried to speak again, but I cut him off. Don't even bother, Paul. You've said enough. I turned to Clara, my voice shaking with anger. Do you even understand what you've done? You've destroyed everything. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I never wanted to hurt you. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, my voice sharp. Sorry doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal. And it sure as hell doesn't rebuild the trust you've shattered. Julia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm done with this, she said, her voice trembling. Paul, pack your things. You're not coming home tonight, or ever. Paul looked stunned. Julia, wait. No, she said, cutting him off. We're done. I can't even look at you right now. She turned to me, her expression softening. Rob, I'm so sorry. For everything. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Julia stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Paul hesitated, then rose to follow her, but I stopped him. Not yet, I said, stepping in front of him. We're not done. Once Julia was gone, I turned my full attention back to Clara and Paul. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice cold and steady. You're going to tell the kids. Both of you. Clara's eyes widened in horror. Rope? No. Please. Don't drag them into this. They deserve to know the truth, I said firmly. You don't get to hide behind lies anymore. Paul started to protest. Rob, think about what this will do to them. Don't you dare act like you care about them now, I snapped. You've already destroyed their family. The least you can do is own up to it. Clara buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Paul stood there, silent and defeated. I felt no pity for either of them. They had made their choices, and now they had to face the consequences. We'll sit the kids down tomorrow, I continued, and you'll tell them everything. After that, I'm contacting a lawyer. This marriage is over. Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears. Rob, please, we can fix this. No, we can't, I said, my voice breaking. You've made sure of that. The weight of everything pressed down on me as Paul finally left, and Clara retreated to the guest room. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the darkened TV screen. The house was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Tomorrow the kids would know. Tomorrow, the facade would crumble completely. There was no turning back now. The next day began with a heaviness that felt impossible to shake. Clara had barely left the guest room since the confrontation, while I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cold cup of coffee. The kids were upstairs, completely oblivious to the emotional wreckage about to be dropped on them. By late morning, Clara emerged, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't bothered with her usual routine. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were puffy from crying. She glanced at me, but said nothing. I simply gestured toward the living room, where the kids were waiting. Emma and Max sat on the couch, looking confused and slightly annoyed. Emma, at 16, had the same no-nonsense attitude that sometimes reminded me too much of her mother. Max, at 13, was quieter, more sensitive, and prone to keeping his emotions bottled up. Both stared at Clara and me as we took our seats across from them. What's going on? Emma asked, her arms crossed. Why the family meeting? Max fidgeted, sensing the tension. Are we in trouble? He asked hesitantly. Clara took a deep breath, clasping her hands together. No, you're not in trouble. But there's something very serious we need to talk about. I watched as her words stumbled out, each one sticking in her throat like splinters. She glanced at me for support, but I stayed silent. This was her mess, and she needed to own it. Your father and I, she hesitated, her voice faltering. We've been going through a difficult time. Emma raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Yeah, we figured. You two have been weird for weeks. Just spit it out. Clara winced at her daughter's bluntness. I've made some mistakes, she said, her voice cracking. Big mistakes. And I need to tell you the truth. Max sat up straighter, his wide eyes darting between us. What mistakes? Clara's lip trembled as she finally said it. I've been seeing someone else. Behind your father's back. The words hung in the air like a bomb, just waiting to explode. Emma's mouth fell open, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. Max, on the other hand, froze, his face going pale as he processed what he'd just heard. You're kidding, Emma said, her voice dripping with disdain. Please tell me this is some kind of sick joke. It's not a joke, I said quietly, my tone firm but devoid of anger. I didn't want to add to the emotional chaos already brewing. Your mom, and I thought you needed to know the truth. Emma shot to her feet, pacing the room with her arms flailing. This is so messed up. How could you? How could you do this to Dad? To us? Emma, please, Clara said, tears streaming down her face. I know I've hurt all of you. I never wanted to. Don't even start. Emma snapped, her voice breaking. You didn't just hurt us. You wrecked everything. How could you be so selfish? Max, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice trembling. Who? Who was it? He asked, his wide eyes locked on his mother. Was it someone we know? Clara hesitated, glancing at me, silently pleading for help. But I refused to intervene. She had to face the consequences. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely audible. It was Uncle Paul. The room exploded. Uncle Paul. Emma shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. Are you serious right now? Uncle Paul? Mom, that's Aunt Julia's husband. How could you do that to her? To us? Max buried his face in his hands, his small body shaking. This is so screwed up, he mumbled, his voice muffled. Emma turned to me, her face flushed with fury. And you knew about this? You let her tell us like this? I met her gaze, my voice calm but firm. I found out a few days ago. Your mom needed to tell you herself. Well, great job, she spat. Now we're all scarred for life. Emma, Clara cried, reaching out, but her daughter recoiled. Don't touch me, Emma snapped. I don't even want to look at you right now. Max stood suddenly, his eyes brimming with tears. I'm going to my room. Max, wait. Clara started, but he bolted up the stairs, slamming his door behind him. The room fell into a heavy silence. Clara sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap. Emma stood by the window, her back to us, breathing hard. I stayed in my seat, staring at the carpet, my mind a swirl of guilt, anger, and sadness. You've destroyed this family, Emma said finally, her voice hollow. I hope you're happy. She turned on her heel and followed Max upstairs, leaving Clara and me alone in the wreckage. Clara buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered. I didn't want to hurt them like this. I looked at her, my expression hard. But you did, and now we all have to live with it. The fallout from the confession lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Emma and Max barely spoke to Clara for the rest of the weekend. Max retreated into his room, emerging only for meals, while Emma's silence was more menacing, her fury simmering just beneath the surface. Every interaction between Clara and her daughter was met with icy glares and clipped responses. But Emma wasn't just angry. She was determined. Monday afternoon, I was working in the garage when Emma appeared in the doorway, her phone in hand and her face set in grim determination. Dad, she said, her voice sharp, we need to talk. I wiped my hands on a rag, bracing myself. What's wrong? Emma stepped inside, lowering her voice. I've been digging into Mom's stuff. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. And I found something bad. My stomach dropped. What did you find? Emma hesitated, then held up her phone. On the screen was a bank statement, clearly marked with both Clara's and Paul's names. The account had tens of thousands of dollars in it. They've been hiding money together, Emma said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disgust. It's a joint account, and it's not for something innocent like family expenses. Look at the transactions. I took the phone from her, scrolling through the list. There were charges to high-end restaurants, boutique hotels, and even a jewelry store. My jaw tightened as I realized this account wasn't just a tool for their affair. It was a record of their indulgence, their blatant disregard for their families. When did you find this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Last night, Emma said. I couldn't stop thinking about how casual Mom was about the whole thing. So, I went through her laptop while she was in the shower. The login info was saved. She crossed her arms. I know it was wrong, but I don't care. She deserves it. I nodded, my mind racing. You did the right thing, Emma. Her eyes hardened. What are you going to do about it? That evening, I confronted Clara. She was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, when I dropped the printed bank statement on the coffee table in front of her. What is this? I demanded. Clara glanced at the paper, her face paling. Where did you get that? Emma found it. I said, my voice cold. She was so disgusted by your affair that she started looking for answers. And now we know you and Paul have been funneling money into a secret account. Care to explain?" Clara's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I can explain," she stammered. "By all means," I said, folding my arms. "Go ahead." She wrung her hands, her voice trembling. "It was Paul's idea. He said we needed a way to cover our tracks, to pay for things without anyone noticing." "Things?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean your little rendezvous? The fancy dinners? The jewelry?" Clara flinched. "It wasn't just for that. It was supposed to be for emergencies, in case we got caught and needed a safety net." I laughed bitterly. "A safety net? Are you serious? You've been lying to me, to the kids, to Julia. And you thought a secret stash of money would fix everything when the truth came out?" Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't know what else to do. Emma, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, stormed into the room. "You're unbelievable," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "A safety net? You're destroying 2 families, and all you care about is covering your ass." "Emma, please," Clara began, but Emma cut her off. "Don't," she snapped. "I can't even look at you right now. Do you know what this has done to Max? To me? You've ruined everything, Mom. And for what? A few nights with Uncle Paul and some fancy dinners." Clara's tears spilled over, but Emma wasn't done. She turned to me. "What happens now? Are we just going to keep living like this? Pretending everything's fine?" "No," I said firmly. "This ends now." I turned back to Clara, my voice like steel. "You're going to close that account. Every cent in it is coming back to this family. And then I'm calling a lawyer. This marriage is over." Clara's sobs grew louder, but I felt no sympathy. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a calculated, deliberate scheme to live a double life. And I wasn't going to let her drag Emma, Max, or me down with her. Later that night, Emma came to me again. She was still furious, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly, "for standing up to her." I pulled her into a hug, my own anger softening for a moment. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," I said, "but we'll get through it. I promise." She nodded against my chest. "Just don't let her get away with it." "I won't," I assured her, and I meant it. The next day, I wasted no time. I called a lawyer, David Grant, who came highly recommended for handling high-conflict divorces. He was a no-nonsense man in his late 50s, with a sharp mind and a reputation for being ruthless when necessary. Sitting across from him in his office, I laid everything on the table: the affair, the bank account, the emotional wreckage it had caused. David listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You've got a strong case," he said, "especially with the bank account. That's going to hurt her in court. Judges don't look kindly on financial deceit in divorce proceedings." "And the kids?" I asked, my voice tight. "I want full custody. Clara's actions have already done enough damage to them." David nodded. "We'll fight for that. But be prepared. Custody battles can get messy, especially when older kids like yours are involved. Judges will take their preferences into account, which may work in your favor." As I left his office, I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in days, I had a sense of control over the chaos Clara had unleashed. But I knew the battle was far from over. Back at home, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her face pale. "Did you go see a lawyer?" she asked. "Yes," I said bluntly. "This marriage is over, Clara." Her lower lip trembled. "Rob, please, we can work this out. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes." I shook my head. "It's too late for that. You didn't just make a mistake, Clara. You made choices, calculated, deliberate choices. And now, you have to face the consequences." She stared at me for a moment, then broke down, sobbing into her hands. I felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside. Her tears couldn't erase what she'd done. That evening, Emma took her investigation further. Clara's laptop was still accessible, and with her newfound determination, Emma dug through emails, messages, and transaction records. What she uncovered was even worse than I'd imagined. "Dad," she said, coming to me with her phone in hand, "you're not going to believe this." I looked at the screen, where she'd pulled up an email chain between Clara and Paul. In the messages, they discussed using the secret account to book a trip to Paris, a celebration for making it 6 months without being caught. The trip was planned for next month, conveniently timed when Julia was scheduled to visit family in Maine, and I would be out of town for a work conference. They were going to run off together, Emma said, her voice trembling with anger, while you and Aunt Julia were busy. Can you believe this? I clenched my fists, my mind racing. The audacity, the sheer callousness of their plan was staggering. It wasn't enough for them to betray us. They wanted to flaunt it. We're not letting this slide, I said. Not a chance. The next day, I called Julia and asked her to come over again. When she arrived, I showed her the email chain. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. They were planning a romantic getaway, she said, her voice rising with fury. While you and I were busy holding down the fort, I nodded grimly. They didn't just cheat on us, Julia. They used us. They built their little fantasy on our backs. Julia paced the living room, her hands balled into fists. I'm done playing nice, she said. Paul's not just losing me. He's losing everything. His reputation, his cushy job, his precious social circle. I'm burning it all down. Together, we hatched a plan. Julia would confront Paul with the emails while I took the evidence to Clara. It was time to strip away the last shreds of their illusion. Julia left, her resolve like steel. When I turned to find Clara, I found her in the guest room, sitting on the bed with a photo album open in her lap. It was filled with pictures of our family, vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings. Her face was a mask of regret, but I didn't care. Clara, I said sharply. She looked up startled. I know about Paris. Her eyes widened in shock, and her hands flew to her mouth. Rob, save it, I snapped, tossing the printed emails onto the bed beside her. You've done enough. Pack your things. You're leaving tonight. Her voice cracked as she pleaded. Where am I supposed to go? Anywhere but here, I said. This isn't your home anymore. As Clara packed her bags, Emma and Max watched silently from the top of the stairs. Emma's expression was one of satisfaction. Max looked conflicted but said nothing. When Clara finally walked out the door, dragging her suitcase behind her, the house felt lighter. Emma came downstairs and stood beside me. Good riddance, she muttered. I placed a hand on her shoulder. It's going to be okay, I said, more for my own reassurance than hers. We'll get through this. But deep down, I knew the real fight was just beginning. The days after Clara's departure felt surreal. The house was quieter, almost too quiet, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Max kept to himself, rarely speaking more than a few words at a time. Emma, on the other hand, was like a whirlwind, her anger fueling her actions. She threw herself into school and extracurricular activities, but every so often, I'd catch her staring off into the distance, her jaw clenched. The betrayal had left its mark on all of us. One evening, as I was organizing documents for the divorce case, Emma came into the room with a determined look on her face. Dad, I've been thinking, she began, sitting down across from me. We can't just let her and Paul get away with this. They won't, I assured her, gesturing to the growing stack of evidence on the table. The lawyers will make sure of that. Emma shook her head. No, I mean socially. People like them, they thrive on appearances. They care about what people think of them more than anything else. We need to expose them. Her words gave me pause. Part of me wanted to keep this whole sordid mess as private as possible for Max's sake, but another part, a darker, angrier part, wanted the world to know exactly what Clara and Paul had done. What are you thinking? I asked cautiously. Emma leaned forward, her eyes blazing. We tell Aunt Julia everything, every last detail, and then we let her decide how to handle Paul's social life. You know, she's connected book clubs, charity events, PTA committees. She can ruin him. It was a tempting idea, but I hesitated. Emma, this could get ugly. And once it's out there, we can't take it back. Good, she said without hesitation. They didn't think about us when they were sneaking around. Why should we protect them now? That night, I called Julia and told her about Emma's plan. She listened quietly, her breathing steady, until I finished. You know, she said finally, I've been thinking the same thing. Paul built his reputation on being this upstanding, trustworthy guy. He's been using it to climb the social ladder for years. It's time people saw the truth. Are you sure? I asked. This will blow everything up. I'm sure, she said firmly. They deserve every ounce of fallout. The following week, Julia began her quiet campaign. She started with her closest friends, sharing the story in careful, deliberate detail, complete with the evidence I'd provided. From there, the news spread like wildfire through our small community. Clara and Paul had underestimated the power of gossip. Within days, their names were on everyone's lips. At the grocery store, I overheard two women whispering near the produce aisle. "Did you hear about Paul and Clara?" One said, her voice low but urgent. "Unbelievable," the other replied. "And with their families so close? How disgusting." At Max's soccer game, I caught a few of the other parents casting sidelong glances my way, their conversations abruptly stopping when I walked past. Normally, the attention would have bothered me, but this time, I welcomed it. Let them talk. Let the truth come out. Clara called me that weekend, her voice frantic. "Rob, you need to put a stop to this," she said. "People are calling me, texting me. Everyone's talking about it. What did you expect?" I replied coldly. "You and Paul made your bed. Now you get to lie in it." "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lost clients. The gym canceled my membership. Even the kids' school sent me a warning about the disruption I'm causing." I laughed bitterly. "And you think I'm going to feel sorry for you? After what you've done?" "I made a mistake," she pleaded. "A terrible mistake, but I don't deserve this." "Yes, you do," I said, my tone like ice. "This isn't just about you and me, Clara. You betrayed your family, your sister, your children. Actions have consequences." She was silent for a long moment, then hung up without another word. Emma, ever resourceful, found out that Paul had been forced to resign from his position at work. Apparently, someone had anonymously forwarded copies of the bank statements and emails to his boss. Whether it was Julia or one of her friends, I didn't ask. "Aunt Julia's a genius," Emma said with a smirk when she told me the news. But not everyone was celebrating. Max overheard the conversation and slammed his bedroom door later that night. When I went to check on him, he was sitting on his bed, his head in his hands. "Why does it have to be like this?" he asked, his voice thick with frustration. "Why does everyone have to know?" I sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Because sometimes, Max, people need to face the consequences of their actions. And unfortunately, this affects all of us." He nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. As the weeks went on, Clara and Paul became social pariahs. Their glamorous outings were replaced with hushed whispers and avoided eye contact. Julia filed for divorce, just as I had, and both cases moved forward with undeniable momentum. We weren't whole, but for the first time, it felt like we were moving toward a resolution. Emma's discovery of the secret bank account hadn't just been a revelation, it was a weapon, and she wasn't done wielding it. After Clara moved out, Emma dug deeper into the account's history, using her sharp intellect and knack for technology to piece together a trail of transactions. What she found changed everything. One afternoon, Emma burst into my office, her laptop tucked under her arm. "Dad, you need to see this," she said, her eyes blazing with excitement. I sighed, pushing aside the stack of legal paperwork. "Emma, I thought we were done with the digging." "We are," she said quickly. "But this is important." She opened her laptop, bringing up a spreadsheet she'd compiled. "It's the transactions from the secret account," she began. "Look at this." She pointed to a series of payments, each made to a vague entity called Haven Consulting. The amounts were significant, thousands of dollars transferred monthly. At first, I thought it was just another way for Mom and Paul to hide their spending. But then I looked up the company. She paused for dramatic effect, and I couldn't help but smirk. "Emma, just tell me." "It's a shell company," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "It doesn't actually do anything. It's just a front. And the account it's linked to?" She clicked to another tab, revealing more information. "It's offshore. They were siphoning money out of the country." My jaw dropped. "You're telling me Clara and Paul were laundering money?" "Not exactly," Emma said, "but they were definitely hiding it. My guess is they were planning to run away eventually, start over somewhere far away where no one would know them." The thought made my blood boil. Clara and Paul hadn't just betrayed their families. They'd planned to abandon them entirely. Emma, however, wasn't done. "Here's the best part," she said, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "I found the access codes." "What?" I asked, leaning closer. "Mom was careless," Emma said smugly. "She saved the login info for the offshore account in her password manager. It wasn't hard to figure out." "Emma," I began, my tone cautious. What are you thinking? Simple, she said, her eyes gleaming. We take the money. At first, I balked at the idea. We can't just take their money, I said. That's illegal. Dad, Emma countered, crossing her arms. They've already broken the law by hiding it. And honestly, after everything they've done, do you really think they deserve to keep it? She had a point, but the thought of crossing that line made me uneasy. What would we even do with it? I asked. Emma shrugged. Use it for something good, something they'd never expect, like helping Max and me go to college, or donating it to charity. Anything but letting them keep it. I mulled it over for a long time. The idea of turning their betrayal into a victory for our family was tempting, more than tempting. It felt like justice. All right, I said finally, but we do this carefully. No mistakes. Over the next few days, Emma and I worked together to transfer the funds. She was meticulous, setting up a new account under my name and routing the money through several layers to avoid detection. By the end of the week, nearly $250,000 sat in our new account. Where do you think all this came from? I asked one evening as we reviewed the transactions. Emma frowned. It's not just personal funds. Look at these deposits. She pointed to several large sums coming from suspicious sources. They've been pulling money from Aunt Julia's accounts, too. My stomach turned. Paul had been stealing from Julia to fund his affair. The audacity was staggering. Once the funds were secure, Emma made her next move. Without telling me, she donated a significant chunk of the money, $50,000, to a local charity that supported single mothers and families in crisis. When I found out, I was initially furious. Emma, you can't just throw that kind of money around without telling me. I didn't throw it around, she shot back. I gave it to people who need it. People Mom and Paul would never care about. Her reasoning was sound, and eventually I let it go. The remaining money was set aside for Emma and Max's future, ensuring they'd have the support they needed no matter what happened. When Clara found out about the missing funds, because of course she eventually did, she called me in a rage. Where's the money, Rob? She demanded. I stayed calm. What money? Don't play dumb, she snapped. I know you took it. That account was mine. Actually, it was yours and Paul's, I corrected. And last I checked, marital assets are fair game. You should have thought about that before you started hiding money. You had no right, she began, but I cut her off. I had every right, I said firmly. Consider it repayment for the damage you've done. Clara was livid, but there was nothing she could do. She'd burned every bridge, and now she was reaping what she'd sown. As for Paul, Julia used the evidence Emma uncovered to obliterate him in court. He walked away with nothing. No house, no savings, no reputation. He was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, just as Clara was. Emma, ever pragmatic, summed it up best. They thought they could control everything, she said one evening as we sat in the living room. But in the end, they lost it all. And she was right. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional recovery. Clara's anger over the lost funds simmered, but with no legal recourse and mounting evidence of her and Paul's misdeeds, she had little choice but to back down. Meanwhile, Paul, now penniless and ostracized, moved into a dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. Word spread quickly through our small community, and Julia became something of a local hero for taking him down so publicly. Clara tried to make amends with Emma and Max, but they wanted nothing to do with her. Emma was especially unforgiving. Her relationship with Clara reduced to cold civility during the rare times they spoke. Max was quieter in his anger, but it was clear he felt deeply betrayed. He refused to visit Clara. Even on the weekend she begged for. I'm not ready, Max told me one evening when Clara called to ask for him. She ruined everything, Dad. How can she expect us to just act normal? I didn't push him. Clara had made her choices, and the consequences were hers to bear. As the dust settled, I focused on rebuilding what Clara had torn apart. Emma and Max became my priority. I threw myself into their lives, helping Emma with college applications, attending Max's soccer games, and simply being present for them in ways I hadn't been able to before. Emma thrived, channeling her anger into productivity. She earned a scholarship to her dream school, but she decided to use the funds we'd taken from the secret account to avoid student loans. Mom doesn't get to control my future anymore, she said firmly. That money's better spent on me and Max than on her stupid trips with Paul. Max, too, began to come out of his shell. He took up martial arts, saying he wanted to be stronger emotionally and physically. Watching him find an outlet for his emotions was a relief, and I encouraged him every step of the way. And me? I went to therapy for the first time in my life. At first, I resisted, thinking I could handle everything on my own, but the therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Keller, helped me unpack the years of resentment and neglect I'd bottled up during my marriage. Slowly, I began to see a path forward, a life where Clara's betrayal didn't define me. The final chapter came unexpectedly. One evening, Clara showed up at the house unannounced. She looked tired, her once polished appearance frayed around the edges. "Rob," she said, standing on the porch, "can we talk?" I hesitated but stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What do you want, Clara?" I asked, my tone wary. She wrung her hands, looking down at her feet. "I've lost everything," she said. "Paul's gone. He left town a few weeks ago. I'm living with a friend because I can't afford rent. And the kids, they won't even look at me." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, "but I need to say it. I'm sorry. For everything. For hurting you, for hurting the kids, for being so selfish. I've destroyed everything good in my life, and it's all my fault." I stood there, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of every lie, every betrayal. But another part, the part that had worked so hard to heal, felt nothing but pity for her. "I accept your apology," I said finally. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Clara. What you did, it changed everything. There's no going back." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I hope someday Emma and Max can forgive me too." "That's up to them," I said. "And you'll have to earn it." She left quietly, and I stood on the porch for a long time, staring into the night. It felt like the closing of a door, not just on Clara, but on the life we built together. In the end, the pain Clara and Paul caused didn't destroy us. If anything, it made us stronger. Emma went on to excel in college, studying law and vowing to fight for families like ours. Max found his confidence through martial arts, eventually earning a black belt and teaching younger kids in his spare time. As for me, I found peace in the little things. Saturday mornings with my kids, quiet evenings reading by the fire, and the knowledge that we'd survived something that could have broken us. One day, years later, Emma came to me with news. "Dad," she said smiling, "I've been offered a position at a family law firm. They help kids in messy divorces." I hugged her tightly, pride swelling in my chest. "Your mom may have broken us," I said, "but you've shown her and the world what it means to rise above." And in that moment, I knew we'd truly moved on. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.